Okay, so we can begin by doing the three, at least three mental bows to the Buddha. One, two, three. And then we'll do the salutation one time. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the fully enlightened one. And then I'm going to share the screen. Okay, is the screen visible?
Yes, Bhante, we can see the screen.
Okay, so now we're continuing with our reading of the numerical discourses, and we're still in the Book of Sevens, and we come to two suttas on called perceptions, or the Pali word is sanya, and one of them is very short. It just gives a list. So we're going to skip over the list sutta and go to the second one, which takes the same seven perceptions, but again gives an elaboration of them. And so we start off when the Buddha emphasizes that these seven, let's put the Pali word in. Oops. Oh, there it goes. Seven sanya. So seven perceptions, when developed and cultivated, are of great fruit and benefit. And the great fruit and benefit is that they culminate in the deathless. They have the deathless. The deathless, of course, is nibbana, the unconditioned state, liberation from birth and death. So they have the deathless as their consummation, the deathless as their goal. And what's quite important to note here, like usually when we think about Buddhist meditation, we think of it just as a way of sort of quieting the mind or focusing the mind, collecting the mind, being mindful of the present, mindful of the here and now. Just don't dwell on the past, don't dwell on the future. Just let the mind dwell peacefully in the present. But that's not the totality of the Buddhist practice of liberative meditation. To actually practice the way to liberation, one also has to use a certain amount of reflection, examination in order to develop a kind of nibbida. That's sort of the key word, disenchantment with the worldly life, and to propel the mind in the direction of liberation, propel the mind from the realm of birth and death, samsara, to the realm of the deathless, freedom from birth and death. And so one uses this, sometimes this conceptual reflection in order to clarify one's understanding and sort of to pave the way to direct insight into the nature of things. And so we have this word sanya, which has several like shades of meaning. In the context of the five aggregates, sanya, we could say, is really perception in the sensory sense, perception of visible forms, perception of sounds, odors, tastes, tactile sensations, and the inner perception of ideas. But here we could say sanya has maybe more than nuance. So we use the word perception, But the idea, or we could say the perception, maybe it could signify ideas, but not just as fleeting ideas, but themes for contemplation and reflection. And when we use these themes for contemplation and reflection repeatedly, they generate a clear, powerful, direct perception of the subject of these themes. And so here we have 7 perceptions or 7 themes. One is asubha, unattractiveness, the next perception of death, perception of the repulsiveness of food, the perception of non-delight in the entire world, then the familiar perception of impermanence, the perception of dukkha, the unsatisfactory nature of what is impermanent, and then the perception of non-self in what is dukkha, unsatisfactory. Here, just for consistency, I use the word suffering for dukkha, but dukkha really has much wider range of meanings than suffering as we ordinarily understand it. Okay, so this is the sort of summary statement or the introductory statement where the Buddha just enumerates these 7 perceptions. Now he's going to elaborate on each one. So let us move on. To move this bar out of the way. Okay. Okay, so we start off with the perception of unattractiveness. And in Pali, this is asubha sanya. And that means particularly, I have to say also, before we elaborate, that you have to remember the Buddha is teaching these 7 perceptions to monastics, to the bhikkhus. And so this is pretty powerful stuff. It's going to be like really strong medicine that we're going to be swallowing this morning. So the way, sometimes when you have news reports, if there's going to be film, a video of war taking place in some country, will say, the newscaster will say, the scenes that will be followed will be disturbing to some people. So if you are very sensitive to things like that, maybe you will tune out for a few minutes. So if you are very sensitive to very powerful statements of the nature of things, you might want to skip this class. And the people who are here, I'll give you a chance to gently step out of the classroom. Okay. Okay, so this is the asubha sanya, the perception of, it's literally the non-beautiful nature, and it's referring to the non-beautiful nature of the body. And this is what the Buddha recommends, as we see, particularly as the antidote to kama raga, to sensual lust or sexual desire. Because for those who are really seeking the direct path to liberation, one has to weaken and eventually to remove the craving for sensual pleasures, and especially in its strongest, at least one of the strongest forms, is the desire for sexual enjoyment, which is quite natural. I mean, for human beings, it's the inherent nature of all sentient beings, from the, I don't know about the ants, but certainly if you look at animals out in the wild, deer, monkeys, I've a lot of experience like seeing monkeys out in the wild. Dogs, cats, rabbits, mice, all of them have that same basic desires, the desire to reproduce. I remember back in the early days when I became a monk, people would say to me, well, what will happen if if all the males become monks, all the women become nuns, observing complete sexual abstinence, then it's going to be the end of the human population on the earth. So what is my answer? Don't worry. It's never going to be the case that everybody becomes a monk and every man becomes a monk and every woman becomes a nun. So you could present the same argument. What's going to happen if everybody becomes a medical doctor? Then there will be no engineers, no um, sanitation workers, no lawyers, no clerks, no software developers, just medical doctors. So don't have to worry about that. Okay, so here we have the perception of unattractiveness. As I said, it's the unattractive nature of the body. And here the Buddha doesn't explain how this is practiced, not in this sutta, but we know from other suttas that the perception of unattractiveness, the asubha sanya, is developed by sort of examining the body, sort of dissecting the body into its constituent parts. So the old suttas mention 31 parts, then a little layer that comes a little bit later adds the brain. So we get the classical formula for the 32 parts of the body. And so one goes through the body in terms of these 32 parts, starting from the outside, hairs of the head, body hairs, the nails, fingernails, and toenails, teeth, and skin. And then next one cuts through the skin to the muscles, sinews, bones, bone marrow. And then one goes into the organs, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, and lungs. Then to the digestive organs, the intestines, large intestine, small intestine, mesentery that binds the intestines, stomach, then the fecal matter, and then they add the brain at the end of that list. So the brain, then we come to the fluids, bile, pus, blood, wait, bile, pus, blood, wait, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, then tears, the oil of the skin, saliva, nasal mucus, oil of the joints, and urine. So those are the 32 parts. And so one goes through examining the body again and again. It's not just a matter of reading a list or just doing it one time, but one has to start off with one's own body, examining one's own body, till one gets a very, very clear inner perception of these 32 parts. And then one can start imposing that reflection upon the bodies of others until one sees that all bodies are just, or at least all human bodies are composed of these 32 parts, and of course many other parts as well, but those are the 32 selected for contemplation. And as one does this repeatedly, it serves as the antidote. Sort of the opposite is subha sanya, the perception of the body as being beautiful and attractive and enticing and alluring. And so when one does this, then the subha sanya gets weakened and weakened until it falls away. And one could bring up this perception of unattractiveness whenever one has to. And so that perception of unattractiveness, I have to say, this statement has to be sort of interpreted. The perception of unattractiveness itself doesn't directly lead to the deathless, because to reach the deathless, you have to develop insight through vipassana. But the perception of unattractiveness helps to weaken the grip of sensual desire. And in that way, it sort of counteracts the hindrance of kama chanda, sensual desire. And that sort of opens up the pathway to the development of samadhi and then to the development of deep vipassana or insight, which brings realization of the deathless. Okay, now this is a bit strong, what's going to come next. But let me go, okay, here it is. We have to remember that this is the Buddha now. He's teaching monastics who have taken on the vow of brahmacharya to observe the life of celibacy, the life of complete restraint from sexual enjoyment. And so sort of one of the biggest obstacles to leading the monastic life is the lure of sexual pleasure, the prospect of sexual pleasure. And so when, say, when I ordained as a monk, a group of well, what I was told is that like 90% of those who ordain, when they're young, when they're teenagers or early 20s, will not continue as monks when by the time they reach their 40s and 50s. And so what is the big lure that pulls people away from the monastic life? Not the prospect of getting a good job in the computer industry or opening up one's business, not the prospect of being able to drive a car whenever one wants, but it's the desire for a partner. And so to continue in the monastic life, the Buddha has to put an emphasis on developing this perception of the unattractive, the asubha. So when one gets ordained, as part of the ordination procedure, the preceptor will tell the newly ordained monk, he gives him his first sort of meditation instruction is Kesa, Loma, Naka, Danta, Tacho. Hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, skin. So that's part of the sort of the formal ordination procedure, even though it doesn't mean that the newly ordained monk has to practice this meditation, but it's just a formality. Okay, so when one often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of unattractiveness, then the mind shrinks away from the idea of sexual intercourse. In Pali, it's metuna dhamma, maituna. Literally, it means coupling, coming together as a couple. So when the mind shrinks away from sexual intercourse, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn towards it, and then either equanimity or indifference towards it, or revulsion towards it, patikulyata is the Pali word, becomes established in him. Again, I said this is quite a strong statement. And then the Buddha illustrates this. It's a rather strange simile. Just as a cock's feather or a strip of sinew thrown into a fire shrinks away from it, turns back from it, rolls away from it, it is not drawn towards it. Wow, we get these turkey feathers. We should experiment throwing one into a fire to see, because I've never experimented seeing what happens to a feather if it's thrown into a fire. Anyway, so it turns away from it, not drawn towards it. So it is in regard to sexual intercourse when a monk often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of unattractiveness. So that's when the perception of the unattractive becomes well established, well settled in the mind. But then there's a kind of test that the Buddha mentions next. He says, okay, so if a monk often practices this perception of unattractiveness, but still the mind inclines to sexual indulgence, or if he does not turn away from even the idea of sexual indulgence, then he should understand that I have not successfully developed the perception of the unattractive, that I've still not sort of advanced in my practice of the unattractive, and I haven't attained the fruit of development. So then he clearly can understand this. But when he often dwells with the mind that's familiarized, accustomed to the perception of the unattractive, if his mind shrinks away from the idea of sexual indulgence and either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him, he should then understand, I have developed the perception of the unattractive, and I've made some progress in it. So I've advanced beyond my earlier condition, and I've attained the fruit or the benefit of developing the perception of the unattractive. Thus, he clearly understands this. And so when it's said that the perception of the unattractive, when developed and cultivated, is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, with the deathless as its consummation, that is why this is said. Okay, we'll take a few of these, then we could see whether there are any questions. Okay, now we come to the second perception. Okay, again, there's this kind of like popular idea of Buddhism as a way to enjoy life, to live blissfully and pleasantly and peacefully in the here and now, um, just to dwell happily in the present moment. But again, this is the Vimutti Dhamma, or the Vimutti Magga, the path to liberation. And so one has to sort of weaken and sever that sort of underlying that dwelling peacefully and happily in the present. There's a very subtle attachment to life. And what's really meant by life from the Buddhist perspective is roaming and wandering in the cycle of birth and death and samsara. So the Buddhist teaching is aimed at severing that attachment to birth and death, the attachment that binds us to samsara. And so one of the ways to sort of weaken that attachment and eventually to counteract it is to develop the perception of death. And ironically, in a way, the Buddha says that the perception of death, when developed and cultivated, culminates in the deathless, has the deathless, the amata dhatu, as its consummation. And so how does, again, the sutta doesn't mention here how one practices the perception of death. And in fact, you find different themes relating to the perception of death scattered throughout the suttas and other formulations and Visuddhimagga. And the way I found to tie them all together is to use three primary themes. One is the fact that death is inevitable, inescapable, an absolute certainty. So we have to sort of impress on the mind the fact that, and make it very, very personal, not just that death is absolutely certain and unavoidable, but my death is absolutely certain and unavoidable. And it seems scary, when you begin this meditation, because there's a kind of protective armor over the mind to shield us from the fact that I'm going to die. It's something that happens to other people. That guy was so unlucky that he got hit by a car and he died. This guy was so unlucky that he got a heart attack or terminal cancer and passed away. But certainly not going to happen to me. I'm going to be here forever, right? But we have to make it really personal by reflecting, first of all, death is absolutely certain, inevitable, inescapable. So that's the first theme. Second theme, the arrival of death is completely unforeseeable, unpredictable. We have no idea when it's going to happen. After the class, I could just step out on my way up to the dining hall. Maybe some angry man with a car comes driving up the road, hits me, and I'm gone, just by 11:30 today, I'm gone. We just don't know when it's going to happen. Don't smile. Yeah, so the arrival of death, completely unpredictable. We have no idea when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, what the cause is going to be. And then the third theme that I've found is useful is to reflect that when death takes place, we have to relinquish everything, everything we possess, all of our loved ones, and even this physical body, have to give it up. Okay, so those are some of the ideas that are used. And it's not just a matter, again, of entertaining these intellectually, but one has to turn these ideas over and over in the mind and apply them personally and directly to oneself. And so when you often dwell with a mind that becomes familiar with the perception of death, when you can see and understand very clearly that I will die, then the mind shrinks away from that subtle attachment to life. That attachment to life, it's very deep-seated, very instinctual, we could say. But when we have that perception of death um, impressed upon the mind, then when the death comes, when it calls for us, then we're able to just let go of this life and move on. So then the mind shrinks away from that attachment to life, turns back from it, rolls away from it, and is not drawn towards it. And again, either equanimity or revulsion becomes settled in him. Okay, then it uses the same simile about the cock's feather or the strip of sinew thrown into the fire. Okay, then comes the sort of counter, the test. So when a monk often dwells with a mind that's accustomed to the perception of death, if his mind inclines to that attachment to life, or if he doesn't turn away from it, he should understand, I haven't developed the perception of death. I haven't made that progress, and I have not attained the fruit of development. I think I have to confess, frankly, that I'm not a success in this. still have that attachment to life, but still have to go on with the contemplation, the reflection on death. Okay, but if when he often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of death, if his mind shrinks away from attachment to life, and then either equanimity or revulsion is settled, becomes settled in him, then he can understand. Where is that? Okay. I have developed a perception of death. I've made progress in my practice. I've attained the fruit of development. So probably the real high point, the perfect fruit of development is when you can become indifferent to whether one lives or dies. Of course, as long as one is, at least my own feeling, in fairly good health, one wants to go on living, one doesn't want to unnecessarily put one's life at risk. But when death comes, one should be able to let go of the body, let go of the life peacefully, and then move on in accordance with one's karma. Okay, now we'll move on to the third perception. This is the perception, and this seems, again, rather on the strong side, the perception of the repulsiveness of food when developed and cultivated is of great fruit and benefit, culminating in the deathless, etc. Again, we don't find here any instructions on how to develop the perception of the repulsiveness of food. And I don't, the Visuddhimagga gives like detailed explanations, but I haven't actually done this practice myself in a sort of systematic way. But what I found to be useful, sort of to overcome the craving for taste, which is the opposite, is when taking the meal, you break the process of eating down into stages. So I found, I think, 5 stages: taking up the food and bringing it to the mouth, putting the food into the mouth. Okay, so picking up, bringing to the mouth, putting in, that's 3. Actually 6 stages. Then chewing the food, tasting it, and swallowing it. So we have 6 stages. And so when you do this, attending to each of those stages, then, and when you're chewing the food and tasting, you actually focus in closely on the taste. And interestingly, what happens when you're doing this with kind of in a mindful setting, the attachment to the taste fades away. You're just experiencing the taste, but without a delight in the taste. And if you examine yourself when you're eating, especially if you're eating a variety of delicious foods, what you find is that the delight in the taste occurs when you're not actually focused on the taste. It's sort of almost like you get a moment of the enjoyable taste, then comes the delight in the taste. Then there comes the moment of enjoyable taste, then comes the delight in the taste. When the mind slips away from the focus on the taste. But if you just continuously focus on tasting, 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 that delightful taste just turns into a bland taste, just the flavor of the food, but without that delightful, enticing element in it. Even the most delicious food just becomes very bland and plain when you're focused with when you're focused with a concentrated mind continuously mindful of the taste of the food. It just becomes transformed into plain taste element. But you see, when you're chatting with your friends, taking a sip of water, then you go back to taking some food, then it becomes enjoyable and delightful and enticing. But if you're just really focused on the taste, then it becomes just, just the taste element. Yeah, the way the Visuddhimagga explains to develop the repulsiveness of food, you're supposed to reflect that, okay, now I'm chewing the food, but now and the food might be very delicious. Please excuse me if I give the example, but if I take that food, then I spit it out onto a little saucer, and then I consider, should I eat it again? Put it in my mouth and swallow it again? Then you don't want to take you don't want to take another bite of the food and swallow it. But when you have the food in the mouth, it's in exactly the same condition, and yet we swallow it. And then in the Visuddhimagga method, you're supposed to reflect on how the food, when you swallow it, it goes down to the stomach, then it gets uh, attacked by the digestive juices, and then it becomes transformed into a kind of pulp, and then all of the essence gets extracted, and then it turns into feces, and then it gets expelled from the body as in defecation. But I don't think that's really necessary, just enough just to practice mindfulness when eating and in that way reducing the attachment to the taste. Okay, so then the text tells us when a monk often dwells with a mind accustomed to the perception of the repulsiveness of food, his mind shrinks away from the craving for taste. So that is sort of the thing, the quality that has to be counteracted is the craving for taste. And then the mind turns back, rolls away from it, and either equanimity or revulsion becomes established. We have the same process of checking oneself. Okay, we'll take this one, then we'll see if we have any questions. Yeah, well, let's take one more, then we'll check for questions. Okay, now comes the next one. And this is called the perception of non-delight in the entire world. It's a very broad contemplation. Because the mind is always seeking some source of delight in the world. And this is sabbaloke anapirata sanya. Seeking the perception that there's nothing really delightful in the world. And so what is meant here by the world would be the world, you could say, of the objects, the sensory objects, the beautiful sights, the wonderful sounds, beautiful, fantastic music, beautiful fragrances, delightful tastes, everything that is attractive and alluring in the world. And there's no direct instructions that I could find in the sutras on how one develops this perception of non-delight in the world. So, the way I've tried to do it is to contemplate. It almost turns into a reflection to the meditation on death. But what I would do is to do contemplation of birth, old age, sickness, and death. So when you take those four things, that everybody celebrates birth when the baby is born, everybody is happy. But when you really look deeply, what is birth? It's coming into being of just five aggregates that are now going to be devouring parts of the world. And those five aggregates are going to grow up, maybe becomes a strong young adult enjoying life. But then what happens is as time goes on, one grows old, one falls ill in various ways, and then one faces death. So that is the nature of our life. We're born, we grow up, reach maturity, then we decline, we grow old, we fall sick, and we die. And so when you do that, see how it just goes on over and over through. The Buddha says that this samsara is without perceptible beginning. So actually, we could use that Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 14, 15, on the beginningless samsara. So, for example, he says to the monks, what do you think is more the tears that you have shed wandering through the cycle of birth and death, lamenting over the death of your mother, your father, your sons, your daughters, this or the waters in the ocean? And the monks say, the tears we have shed in this samsara, that's more than the water in the ocean. And the blood we've shed as we've been killed in different ways, more than the waters in the ocean. So when you reflect on the beginningless suffering or the suffering of beginningless samsara, then one loses one's delight in the world. And then the perception of non-delight in the world is intended as the antidote to this attraction to, here we have the Pali, loka chitresu. So chitra is originally, the sense is a picture, but I guess a picture of something that's beautiful. And so one finds delight in beautiful things in the world. And I think there's a kind of innocent delight in the world, which is okay, like beautiful sunsets, beautiful scenery, views from mountain ranges. I remember in China, in Fujian province, the mountains, just one mountain range, a row of mountains after another, spectacular. So one really loves those landscapes. And in Vietnam, Halong, is that the Halong Bay? These islands of stone rising up in the bay. So very beautiful and wonderful. But I don't think that's intended to enjoy. In fact, the Buddha himself like enjoys beautiful scenery. But what is meant is, I think, the sort of the glittering, superficial, beautiful things in the world. The neon lights of Times Square or Las Vegas, the gambling casinos, and the Radio City Music Hall with the rows of the dancing girls. So those would be some of the beautiful and delightful things in the world. And so when you develop that perception of non-delight, then the mind shrinks away from this attraction and fascination with the beautiful variety of beautiful things in the world. In fact, there's another word based on chitra, which is vichitra, which then takes on the sense of variety or diversity, the diversity of beautiful things in the world. Like if you go into the Starbucks, in the old days, we used to go into the coffee shop and say, please, a cup of coffee, please. And then you simply get a cup of coffee. But now you go into Starbucks or any other of these sophisticated coffee shops, you have to decide whether it's latte, espresso, mocha, with vanilla, or with what are some of the other special flavors? So many varieties, like 20 different kinds of coffee. So you don't know what to decide. Even drinking water, I've seen drinking water, you get raspberry flavored drinking water, orange flavored, lemon flavored drinking water, lime flavored, cherry flavored. And then I don't have experience with perfumes, but probably so many different types of perfumes for different time of day, different occasions. Okay, so the mind, when you develop that perception of non-delight, then you lose that fascination with the world's beautiful things. Okay, we could see now whether we have any questions or comments. Okay, so I see, okay, first is Vandana.
Thank you, Bhante. This is a very timely sutta for me because I was contemplating on a subha a lot. Uh, One thing which I'm trying to understand then, if when somebody already had a repulsiveness to, say, sexual sexual things, right? Like organs, the sexual organs, then one should try to develop equanimity towards it, opeka, or one should just keep that aversion, because what I learned that aversion and desire both are not should not be cultivated. It should be the middle ground, which is
Oh,
opeka. So,
yeah, okay, this is a good point. Yeah, I would say is that some of these contemplations, are very much tailored to the particular temperament of the person. So these types of contemplations, particularly say the contemplation of death, contemplation of the unattractive nature of the body, are appropriate for the type of person whose mind is dominated or governed by lust and attachment. And so if a person has a tendency towards aversion, these meditations probably would not be the appropriate entry point for them to come into the Dhamma. But for that person, the person whose tendency is towards aversion, towards repulsion, they would probably have to soften their minds with the Brahma Vihara meditations, with the loving kindness and compassion meditations. So this is really appropriate for one who has a strong tendency towards sensual craving, sensual lust. And if they're developing this practice and it's giving rise to aversion, then I think they have to pull the mind back from it and try to establish the mind in equanimity, not let it move further in the direction of aversion.
yeah,
Does
thank
that
you.
make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, yes. And then I think maybe the four elements will be better substitution for
Say I didn't quite catch again.
the element, just doing the contemplation on the five elements.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, turning it into the element meditation then helps to develop the equanimity.
Yes. I think for me, my goal now would be like the beauty, seeing beauty in places like you were mentioning, the mountains and the nice. I like
Yeah.
watching those. So I
Yeah.
have.
Actually, seeing natural beauty helps to uplift and elevate.
Yeah, it
And
does a lot. It's just keeping back of the mind that this also not going to last, and things continuously changing from when I was watching like a rainy some rain in I love rain, and then see, oh, when after that it's going to be muddy and all that bad. So let's just keep that in mind. So I'm just trying all the ways to see.
yeah.
Yeah, the food is one more thing. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Bhante.
Okay, then next is Jia.
Thank you, Bhante. I had a similar question as Vandana, but when it comes to the revulsion, I'm just wondering if a greedy personality use a revulsion to balance out, does that really create karma? Because he used a counteract towards the greed part.
Yeah.
So it's just certain balancing act. Oh my.
I'm not quite, maybe say the question again. I'm not quite sure that I caught the question.
Is this creating any karma? Because it's a counteract. So
Yeah, it does create a karma. But maybe I have to qualify this word, patikula. It's hard to find good English translations. So we use here, I think I use revulsion, and you could also use aversion, but I mean, sometimes it can be emotionally loaded reactions, but the idea is not to create a hatred or ill will, but it's rather just a turning of the mind away from those things.
so can I say it's like a strong Vandana? So you observe the Vandana, but not really turn into the emotion. I mean,
In this case, it's not contemplating Vedana.
uh,
Is that what you said, contemplating Vedana?
yeah,
No, in these perceptions, one isn't contemplating the Vedana. Of course, Vedana will occur along with those
right,
perceptions,
yeah,
but
yeah.
the focus is not on the Vedana, but on the particular theme of reflection, whether it's the nature of the body, the inevitability of death, or the um, contemplating the rev uh, repulsiveness of nutriment, of food, or turning away from the delight in the world.
So contemplating the perception is not really creating any karma. Unless you develop a strong emotion towards it, that will be a karmic event.
No, well, everything, sort of all volitional action creates karma, but this is, the important thing here is not the kind of karma one is creating, but one is developing this disposition of the mind towards sort of moving away from the attachment to the enjoyment of things in the world, towards disenchantment and dispassion, even though it's creating a karma, but it's a positive karma moving towards liberation.
But it's very subtle, right? If you use the equanimity, that will not be a karmic event. But if you
No,
use the
even with
emotion,
equanimity, no, even with equanimity, there'll be a karma, though it's a wholesome kind of karma accompanied by equanimity.
okay, I just want to make sure it's not double up the bad things if it's revulsion developed, right?
Yeah, the revulsion is not a negative emotional revulsion, but it's a kind of turning away that occurs through gaining an insight into the nature of these particular themes of reflection.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Chris Taus.
Thank you, Bhante. Appreciate it. A very interesting passage. One of the things about Buddhism that I've kind of wrestled with and is really sort of central to the things you've talked about today. When we say that we want to turn away from life as sort of like the enjoyments of life and stuff, how do we fit into that perspective the idea that love is a phenomena of human life and that love kind of inherently makes us want to be in this world, and that's something that we should try to cultivate? And like I'm kind of trying to wrestle with where does the existence of love and being a loving person kind of fit into the idea of, we should turn away from life and not want to return to it. So hopefully that makes a certain degree of sense.
Yeah, okay, there are different shades of meaning to the word love.
Mm-hmm. True.
Okay. So we could distinguish love as metta, which is what we translate also as loving kindness. So this is the wish for the well-being, happiness, and safety of all beings, of others. Then there's love, maybe call this domestic love, so that or love within family life. So this will be love between, say, parents and children, husband and wife, um, or between other family members. And then there will be maybe love between friends, a sense of a strong commitment of friends to friends. Okay, so first, um, and then there's a kind of love which is a selfish attachment, also comes under the designation of love. And so what Buddhism would encourage would be a kind of what I would call, to the greatest extent, a selfless love in which one makes a strong commitment to the well-being of others. So that can be within the relationship between friends, within the family, even though naturally there's going to be an attachment, say, of husband and wife to each other, and of parents to their children, children to the parents. But I say that even though from a monastic perspective, aiming at renunciation, that's something that has to be sort of overcome at a certain point. But within the framework of a family life, that kind of love is extremely important as an ingredient for nurturing a healthy, wholesome family life, so that the husband and wife have to make a strong commitment to the well-being of each other and to protect and uphold each other. How does it go in the marriage formula? In sickness, in health and sickness, and so on.
Better or worse, sickness and health. Yeah, it's a tough one.
And of course, the children, the parents have to make a strong, loving commitment to seek the well-being of their children and to do what's best for their children, and also to allow their children the freedom to make their own choices when it's appropriate. Children have to make the loving commitment to their parents, especially when the parents grow old. So all of that is important. And then the sort of ideal form of love, the highest form, is the love of metta and karuna, of loving kindness, the wish for the well-being and happiness of others, and karuna, the compassionate wish and aspiration for others to, or intention for others to be liberated or released from suffering. Yeah, so those are the kinds of love that we would say are affirmed in the Buddha's teaching. I don't know if that makes sense in relation to your question.
Well, I mean, in terms of like turning away from life, I think love is one of those forces that brings us to it. But I, that Buddhism emphasizes love in any form, I think is the really essential point. So, no, I think
so
that's
those are the types of love that the Buddha's teaching affirms. But the ultimate aim of the Buddha's teaching is liberation.
Right.
And so that requires, I would say, the severance of all forms, at some point, the severance of all types of attachment. So each individual has to choose that particular point in which they're ready for that act of, quote, radical renunciation. Okay, see, yeah, I always overlook when I ask for questions the people who are sitting in the library. So Jay, is that?
Based on the same conversation, the perception of non-divine in the entire world,
Yeah.
Won't that contradict with the individuals having a purpose of life?
Having a what?
Purpose of life.
Purpose in life. No, it doesn't contradict having a purpose in life. You could have a purpose, but this is, I think, the antidote towards, I think, taking delight in the, as I said, the variety, the diversity of sensual pleasures available in the world. But it's not in contradiction to having a purpose in life, like setting oneself some goal in life. Yeah, does anybody else in the hall have a question? Yeah, Jenny.
And attachment to the parents. How do you differentiate between like being cold to your parents? So, for example, your parents sick right now, for example, right? And then you have like, I'm far away from my parents. I'm talking about like, my current experience. I really want to like go to see them, because like they're old, and then kind of like at one point, when they were sick, I really want to like, go there, go back to my country, and then to take care of them. But on the other hand, I also like know if I'm here, I'll be like, be able to support them financially better.
Yeah.
And then like my question is like, sometimes I just don't know, like, I feel like I'm a bit like being like, the argument that I make to myself is just like I'm being
The argument is,
being detached from them is like, it's normal, according to the Buddhism, we cannot be too attached to the
Yeah.
parents. But on the other hand, I feel like probably from other people's perspectives, probably it seems like I'm cold. Hey, it's your parents, why don't you just like go home and then take care of them? If I give the advice to my friends whose parents is sick before my parents is sick, I said, no, you should go home, take care of your parents, because it's your parents. But when it comes to mine, it's become, my perspective is kind of shift a bit, so.
okay, so your parents are back in Indonesia. Do you have brothers and sisters? They taking care of your parents?
I feel guilty about it.
I see. Okay, so she's saying that her parents are in Indonesia and she's living here in New York. So she's asking, sometimes she thinks that she can support her parents better by living here and sort of being able to provide some financial support to the parents, but then she feels a little bit guilty. Yeah,
Right, then you have to take care of the parents.
yeah.
Am I not making bad karma?
No, I don't think so. As long as you have like brothers and sisters who are looking after the parents, but from time to time you should go back to see them. But you have your life here in the United States. So I don't think you have to feel guilty about that.
In terms of
No, I don't think that there's anything to worry about karmically.
I keep them.
Yeah, you're providing some support for them.
Also, I can like practice that detachment, right? Because we're talking about the detachment, attachment to the death, about the death contemplation. It's really hard.
So if you feel guilty, maybe you have to go back and spend some time with them. Especially when they get really old, and it's good to spend a little more time with them.
Like,
And then,
if it's too late or something, and then it's gonna be, something happen, which I don't want to think about. But
yeah, you have to, sometimes it's a difficult situation. Okay, we'll take one more. So this will be Gita.
Thank you, Bhante, for the teachings. Much merit, sadhu. Bhante, I was thinking about, in order to develop Nibbida, what I use is the 31 realms of existence.
Wait, I'm not catching the sound. Go back.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, that's better.
Yes, Bhante. Yeah, I was thinking about the 31 realms of existence. That kind of, it turns my mind away from birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, because I think that seeing or taking, if you have unconditional faith and love for the Buddha's teachings, and it's unshakable. And he says there's 31 planes of existence, of which we see only the animal realm. I think that for me, development of that is creating nibbida to ever return back, because also I'm also seeing adinava, the dangers of sansaric existence, which is leading me to vimutti and viraga turning away from it completely and utterly, because we've been around this rodeo many times over.
You've seen what?
So being around the cycle of birth and death
Yeah.
so many times. And it's sad that in the human realm, we can't remember what our past lives were and how much suffering we endured.
Yeah.
But seeing in this present life with our personal experience, I mean, that's enough in my case to help me to turn away from all samsaric existence. And also listening to the Buddha's teachings on the 31 realms is even more motivation to put out the fire.
Yeah. In fact, one of the themes for reflection that's mentioned, we have jati, jara, vyadi, chuti. So we have the four that I mentioned: birth, old age, sickness, death. Then the next one is apaya. That is
Hell realm.
the bad destinations of rebirth, the animal realm, the realm of ghosts, the hell realm,
Asura, yeah.
and then atita, anagata, vata, dukkha, the suffering in the past in samsara, the suffering that lies ahead in the future in samsara.
Yes, Bhante. So the 31 planes are very helpful in my case. Thank you, Bhante. Thank you.
So we're going to have to end the session now. Yes, I see it's 11:23. Okay, so we're going to be ending the session, and we'll end with the sharing of the merits with the devas and the nagas. Akasata cha bhumata deva naga mahidika punyanta manumoditva chirangra kantu sasanam. Akasata cha bhumata deva naga mahidika punyanta manumoditva chirangra kantu desanam. Akasata cha bhumata deva naga mahidika punyanta manumoditva chirangra kantu mang parang. Dukkha patacha nidukkha baya patacha nibaya soka patacha nisoka antu sabe pipanino. May those in suffering be free from suffering. May those in fear be free from fear. May those in sorrow be free from sorrow. May all living beings also be thus. Okay, and then we'll do 3 vows to the Buddha. And we'll have a class next week, next Saturday. That's August 30th. Okay, so those in the room can stand up. Wait, what? Okay. Okay, so thank you all for joining.
And a bow to Bhante. Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you,
Bhante.
Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Have a great lunch, Bhante. Be safe.
Thank
Be
you so
well.
much, Bhante.
Thank you,
Take care,
Bhante. Good to
Bhante.
see you again.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante. Thiruvan Sadnai, Namo Buddhaya. Take care, Bhante. Be well.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Bye.
Bye bye,
Thank you,
Bhante.
Bhante.
Teruan Saranay, Bhante.
Okay.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you very much, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
See you next week,
Thank-
Bhante.